Thank you, Dhamindri and CEPA, for having this discussion. It's important to have this, but it's also it's an issue that's been confronting Sri Lankans for several decades, but it's because of the economic crisis that we've started really exploring different dimensions. So I'll speak to what I understand in terms of my own experience, but also raise some issues that we need to factor in. It follows from the points made in terms of institutional reform, because that's kind of, if you don't address it, we are going to have these conversations over and over again. But maybe just start with, what does justice mean? And justice is very broadly looking at equality, non-discrimination, fairness, ensuring equity, and all of those issues. And when we talk about justice, and in the Sri Lankan context, one of the big things that not everyone wants to talk about is the structural violence that's been there for decades. And this is not, again, something post-war. We're talking about during independence, post-independence, cycles of violence, what led to the cycles of violence, a near 3-decade war. And with the pandemic, it came up again. So, Sri Lanka has been confronted with issues of justice for decades. Justice in terms of racial, class, gender, sexuality, and our own constitution addresses some of it in terms of the fundamental rights chapter, in terms of talking about equality, Article 12. So one would say we have a constitution, at least, that recognizes some dimensions, and I speak from a lawyer's point of view here, but our own constitution, with its own flaws, recognizes there has to be equality and non-discrimination. Is it fully implemented? Of course not. That's why we go to court and challenge these things. But there are also things that are not addressed, or while it's in the paper, or there could be excellent policies, it's not fully implemented. So the cycles of violence and inequalities, if you look at it, from the ethno-religious violence from the 1915 onwards, you have this. We've had these things that have been there for a long time. And the heart of it is impunity, that when you don't address the root causes, when you don't address accountability, and accountability has been thrown a bit in terms of the economic dimension, but accountability on the political violence, on the socio-economic. So you're not going to address the economic, the corruption issues and accountability if you don't address the bigger issues in Sri Lanka. Political identity, about how citizens are treated, if that's not addressed, we're not going to address the economic crimes. So when we talk about justice and economic justice, we need to recognize justice cannot be taken in just silos. And again, we were confronted with this in 2015 when the then government initiated transitional justice and a whole new social contract by way of a constitution, new constitution, and various issues around transitional justice. And this thing about what does justice was confronted at that time, and some of us had those conversations. What does justice mean? But that's the unfortunate thing. Now we are faced by this exceptional economic crisis, but those issues were not addressed for decades. So justice, in a way, cannot be picked to suit a particular time or circumstance. And that's just not going to address the root causes, the structural issues. So when we talk about economic justice, my main point is we need to look at the bigger picture. We need to look at, the issues of food insecurity, health issues, labor, land, all of these things that affect a whole lot of people, and also the citizen mobilization over the decades, raising these issues need to be confronted. So when we talk about economic justice, these are all interconnected. That's why I think it's a great panel, because we bring in the different perspectives. I bring in the legal and the others bring in different perspectives. We can't address the one and think everything else is going to follow. So having the perfect law is not going to address all these issues. Having the perfect structure is not going to address all of these issues. So I thought someone else had a point. So for me, economic justice needs to be looked at holistically and looking at the different dimensions. Now, while we're confronted, and I like the point you raised about the HRC resolution. Now, for the first time, the Human Rights Council last year brought in economic crimes, but it brought in economic crimes through a resolution that started with looking at the legacy of the war, the human rights violations that have occurred for decades. And their point is, these are interconnected, that impunity is interconnected. If you don't address impunity in one, you cannot address the economic crimes, the economic justice. So I will make this point, which I think some have now started to make, is you can't treat things as saying we will address corruption and think the other problems in Sri Lanka are going to be addressed, are going to be solved overnight in, kind of in a miraculous way. So you have to address why are those structural violations, inequalities there for so many decades. Post-independence, 75 years of independence, we still have these issues. We still have a debate as to why is the 13th Amendment such a big issue in Sri Lanka, which has been there in the law books for more than 3 decades. So Human Rights Resolution of 2022 just made a very simple link that some of us have been saying for so many years. If you don't address abuses, if you don't address the cycles of violence, that impunity remains. And that impunity emboldens the political and bureaucratic elite to do what they have done, which has got us into this situation in Sri Lanka. So like it or not, you have to address the fact that in Sri Lanka, citizens have been treated differently by successive governments, by the state, by fellow citizens. So economic justice, while we can say, yes, we can address corruption, we need to have strong institutions, and I'll get to some of the reforms maybe in the second part of the conversation, but my main thrust is that economic justice cannot be addressed as a siloed issue. It needs to be addressed in terms of equality for all citizens. It is a political issue. You can't make it just an economic issue. If you don't have the proper framework, if you have a constitution, and I mean, this is something I'm going to put out there. If you have a constitution that privileges one religion over the other, Article 9, which says Buddhism is supreme, but the same constitution further down says equality for all citizens, you're not going to address those structural issues. So it may be unpopular, but I'm just saying, and we did a poll recently which said 54% feel, 54% of the citizenry feel that that issue needs to be addressed. That equality doesn't come when our own constitution privileges one community over the other, and a few articles down says equality for all. So we have a constitution in itself that creates hierarchies. When you have a constitution that creates hierarchies, when you have structural inequalities that continue to fester under different governments, there is a problem. And the question, I'll leave it here, is who benefits by these hierarchies? Who benefits if there's impunity? Who benefits if these problems are not addressed? And you come to the present issue. Why are we in this crisis? Why is it last year we had an exceptional citizen movement that got a hugely popular government out of office? Fast forward 6 months later, even the conversation about accountability is limited. Why is it that now there is an attempt to delay or postpone elections, a democratic right of the citizenry? And very few people are even having this conversation. So it comes back to democratic processes, fundamental rights, institutions that treat citizens equally.